Hello, AP Psychers. Today we're going to take a look at 8.2, the psychological perspectives. Those are the approaches that we've already talked about and how those approaches are used to look at the causes for different psychological disorders, or the etiology. That's what that word means. So our first one here is the biological model. Now this one is when psychology looks at, for this approach to psychology, the bio approach, it's when psych looks at the brain, neurotransmitters in the body, and genetics. So anything there that is physical. So obviously this model is going to look at those very same things to explain the causes of mental illness. Now, examples like this might include when we look at major depressive disorder, that stands for MDD. So major depressive disorder is linked to low levels of that neurotransmitter serotonin. If you remember, serotonin helps us set the tone, our emotional tone in our body. And so people with generally low levels of serotonin can develop major depressive disorder. That might be a biological cause or an etiology. We also see low levels of norepinephrine linked to depression. Now, it could be genetic. So twin studies with people with bipolar show rates among monozygotic twins, remember those are identical twins, higher than those that are dizygotic or fraternal twins, so showing a genetic link. Again, back to the body, back to a biological cause. Bipolar is also linked to high levels of norepinephrine. Once you understand the difference between MDD and bipolar, the fact that MDD is low with norepinephrine and bipolar is high, you'll kind of understand how that works with manic and depressive episodes. Another good example is that Alzheimer's is linked to low levels of, that is incorrect. I apologize. That should say low levels of acetylcholine. I just went ahead and copy paste what I was writing on MDD. So Alzheimer's is linked to low levels of serotonin. Now, the cognitive model is going to be different. The bio model looked at the body. The cognitive approach to psychology, this is the approach where you look at someone's thoughts, their internal workings, and they're going to explain your behavior based upon how you're thinking. So obviously this model is going to look at the cause of mental illness being improper thinking patterns. So for a great example here, MDD, so major depressive disorder, is linked to cognitive distortions. If you are someone who is explaining things in a very negative way to yourself, maybe you're awfulizing or globalizing them that we've talked about before, you're engaging in negative self-talk, you go to bed and you keep kind of talking to yourself about all the things that went wrong. You have self-defeating beliefs and eventually learned helplessness. The idea is that these thinking patterns culminate in a more depressed mood, and that cognition is what causes that spiral down into depression. Now, I hope you guys are starting to see that if we have a biological model, if we have biological causes for disorders, we're going to use biological treatments such as drugs. If we have cognitive problems, we are going to have therapy methods that look to change thought patterns. And that's definitely the case here with cognitive distortions in the cognitive model. This is great therapy method called Beck's therapy, where they talk it out and they change those cognitive distortions with a therapist. Now, our next one's the behavioral model. So here we're going to go away from the thinking part, and we're just going to look at behavior, just like your classical and operant conditioning people looked at. So this approach, B.F. Skinner, Pavlov, Watson, this approach to psychology is going to look at how classical and operant conditioning explain your behaviors. So they're going to look at how those things caused mental illness. Let's give an example of an anxiety response. Let's say someone develops a phobia. So they get they get attacked by bitten by a spider when they are young. So that's the pain of a spider bite is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditional response to the pain of that spider bite is fear or anxiety. And now the conditioned stimulus is the spider. That is the warning sign that pain is about to come. And then the conditioned response is to avoid spiders. Now, this is how the anxiety response gets acquired. This is a very, very simple example. And then it also gets maintained through operant conditioning. Now, if I see my conditioned stimulus, the spider, I have one of two choices. I can go towards it, but that's going to punish me because I'm going to have a conditioned response of fear, or I can move away from it. And that's a negative reinforcer because I'm going to take the spider out of my life. I'm going to move away from it, and I'm going to have a better existence. So it's going to increase that behavior. And as psych students that have studied classical and operant conditioning, you should know that the fact that I'm going to keep avoiding the fear means that I'm never going to have a period of extinction where I present the conditioned stimulus, nothing happens, and the conditioned response goes away. So this is an example of how these two things can play. We've talked about it before, but how these two things can play in and create and then perpetuate a anxiety response. The psychoanalytic model is going to be a little bit different. So as this approach to psychology looks at the unconscious processes, especially in childhood, to explain our behaviors, this model is going to look at those very same things to explain mental illness. I'm not a huge fan of applying this to mood and anxiety. I think the cognitive, biological, and behavioral do a much better job. But if you were to bring out the psychoanalytic model for this, mood disorders can be seen as a turning of anger inward to the, from the superego into the id and the ego. Anxiety disorders can be a fixation of the unconscious. I think the best example here, though, that I have for you is something that we're going to get to next week, which is somatic symptom disorder. Somatic symptom disorder is when some kind of psychological trauma is manifested physically in the body. So the person might go blind, but doesn't have a biological reason for why they've gone blind. They might lose mobility in certain limbs, but there's no biological reason. We actually don't have a biological explanation for this at all. There's no genetic causes. There's no biological root of any of this. So one of the best explanations we have is that this disorder, somatic symptom disorder, can be unconscious fixations that are manifesting themselves out as physical symptoms. And this is actually one of the reasons why the psychoanalytic model is still used, because it can help explain some of those things. And our last one, this one's new, but the mechanisms, the building blocks are not new for it. So this model combines a biological approach and an awareness of recent environmental happenings. So it says that stressful events can act like a catalyst to trigger biological predispositions. So an example here would be that a patient loses their job and gets their long-term, maybe they lose their job and their long-term partner walks out on them. Let's add, in addition to these environmental things, they have a predisposition to underproduce serotonin. So these two things combined, the trigger is the environmental thing, and it triggers as a catalyst this predisposition that they already had biologically, and these two things together create a bout of major depressive disorder. So diathesis stress is taking a look at having a biological predisposition that gets triggered by stressful events. Okay, guys, this is a look at these different diathesis stress, psychoanalytic, behavioral, cognitive, and biological models. What we're going to do with the case studies is, once you have diagnosed the case study with a different mental illness, once it's hit that diagnostic criteria, I'm going to ask you to go into either your text or your notes to note one of these models as a cause, and then to label that cause with the correct label. So for example, let's say you make a diagnosis of depression, and you go back and you're like, okay, I know that major depressive disorder is linked to low levels of serotonin. You would say that a possible cause is low levels of serotonin in the patient. And then you would label that, because you're pulling from a neurotransmitter, you will label that as a biological model. And we're going to get used to trying to reinforce and understand the causes of mental illnesses every time we go through a case study by doing that. Okay, guys, that is an overview of 8.2. You guys take care.